More on the coronavirus pandemic now, and the government has changed its policy on treating COVID-19, with officials moving away from the idea of herd immunity to widespread self-isolation. Joining me now is Dr. David Bull, former Brexit Party MEP and TV medic. Dr. Bull, why has the government done a U-turn?
Well, I think that's a little disingenuous because obviously this is a very complex situation. It's evolving very rapidly. And essentially the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Officer and the Prime Minister are updating their advice every single day. Now, we are a few weeks behind the rest of Europe, and you can see that in terms of the number of cases here. So we're about to hit this exponential rise in the number of cases. And essentially, the government felt that we would be slightly slower than this getting to this point. So now they've had to accelerate those plans. So now what we have to do is something completely different, which is why they announced that we need to have social distancing, which is why we need to have increased isolation, particularly for those people most at risk. So those are over 60, those people with chronic illnesses, diabetics, and those who are immunosuppressed. Now, you're right in that they talked about herd immunity at the beginning, and they talked about this as being something that was important, but actually, I think the best way of thinking about this is what they want to do is to take those people most at risk, to isolate them. The majority of people who get this disease, 80%, will have mild symptoms and they will get some immunity. We don't know how long for, but what they're saying now is herd immunity is something that we will start to see, but it's really as a side effect of what we're doing rather than as a main aim.
Well, speaking to other experts in the field, they seem to think that herd immunity was almost an experiment. It's not something that's really practiced in these sorts of pandemics, should I say.
I think it's really easy to be critical of the government. You've got to remember we haven't seen this virus before. We know that you get immunity to this virus once you're in contact, but we don't know how long for. Do you get it for that season? Do you get it for a year? Or do you get it for your lifetime? We simply don't know. So you're right in a way in that it is experimental. But I think rather than finger pointing, we need to come together. This is no longer about Europe working together. This is about the world working together. We are facing the most serious public health crisis of anyone's lifetime. And in fact, you have to look back to 1918 to the seasonal flu epidemic, the H1N1 epidemic, which killed thousands of people. And if we're not careful, that will happen again. So now it's about mitigation. It's about making sure that we can actually stop these cases developing because we want to keep the death rate to an absolute minimum.
So if everybody is learning as we're going, different countries are at different stages, why isn't there a consistency in the different states on the approach to containing the virus?
It's a great question. I mean, you know, I was a former MEP, and of course the European Union is looking increasingly shaky. So the European Union likes to think of itself as this overarching umbrella organisation that dictates policy that all of those separate European countries abide by. But actually, what you're seeing is a breakdown of the EU in front of our very eyes. You've seen national governments resorting to protecting their own countries, putting up borders. You've seen that with Italy, with Spain. You've seen it with France. And actually, I think what it's shown more than anything with the suspension of Schengen is the European Union is changing and changing remarkably. I don't think we're going to go back to the same European Union. So you're right. Yes, of course, across Europe, it would be great to have a single policy, but one size doesn't fit all, and that's been the problem with the European Union all along.
Well, Dr. Dable, before you were an MEP, you were indeed a doctor. What would your thought processes be right now if you were on the front line in the medical field?
I think there are a number of things to think about. Firstly, we have a duty to protect the most vulnerable, which is why I welcome the advice for those people to isolate and stay at home. One of the biggest problems for the elderly is, of course, if we're saying 10 weeks at home, that period of isolation will be incredibly traumatic. This will be a period of enormous social isolation. So I think as communities, we need to rally round, ensure the elderly people are fine, and make sure they have enough food to eat. One of the biggest messages, I cannot repeat this enough to people, is stop panic buying. Because by panic buying, you are depriving those people who are most vulnerable, the elderly, those most in need, of food. And that is simply not acceptable. And there is a third point here, which is we also need to ensure that healthcare workers are protected. It's really important that schools stay open as long as possible. We know that children probably get milder versions of this illness, but the minute you close those schools, then the parents have to take time off work, and that will include healthcare workers as well, and indeed grandparents. But the other thing we need to do is we need to also improve the amount of medical equipment we have. At the moment, we have something like 5,000 ventilators. We've heard announcements that may well increase that capacity to 11,000 ventilators. Now, that's still going to be way short of the numbers that we need if there is a full-scale crisis. So I think, this is multifaceted, but really, as a country, this is time that we took stock, we reevaluated, and we started looking after each other.
Well, you mentioned looking out for each other and encouraging people to isolate. So if they are expected to isolate for a considerable amount of time, they're going to be expected to purchase enough supplies to maintain them for that amount of time. So is it not slightly patronising to say, OK, go and self-isolate yourself, but don't prepare, don't buy an extra tin of beans or an extra set of loo roll, because that's panic buying. But what are the people supposed to do?
No, in terms of isolation, what we've said is that actually you need to isolate yourself as much as possible. But of course, going shopping will be part of that routine. Now, the only reason not to do that is if someone in your household has symptoms. So the advice now is if you yourself live on your own and you get symptoms, then you need to self-isolate for 7 days. So most people would have enough food for 7 days. If you are in a mixed household where one of you is unwell, then we're saying you need to isolate for 14 days. So the point is that when you go shopping, of course, do a bigger shop, but don't panic buy. And the issue is that we know the distribution arms are there. We know there are no problems with supplies of goods. The only problems come when people panic buy. And those people who most need this, the elderly, the vulnerable, cannot get the goods they need. So I really welcome some of those really great initiatives coming out of Ireland, for example, where the supermarkets are now going to be open for 1 hour earlier just for older people to shop. That's a great community spirit, I think.
I think Iceland actually are doing something similar in certain parts of the UK. I know the southwest, that's definitely happening there. But if we go back to the government's response and Rishi Sunak's loans that are going to be made available, alone, though, regardless, these companies are going to have this weighing over them through this and whole period and then some.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously I'm not an economist, but I mean, this will be a huge fiscal stimulus. I think one of the things that actually probably has the most resonance for people is having a 3-month mortgage holiday. That will make a massive difference to people. For the vast majority of people, most people are secure in their jobs at the moment. I think those people who are self-employed, those people who own their own companies, they obviously will be in a very worrying position at the moment. And of course, we are really right at the beginning of this outbreak. Now, one of the biggest employers in this country is the travel and tourism industry, and that will be hit very, very hard indeed. And you've heard sort of those pleas from Virgin Atlantic, from British Airways, from huge travel operators saying they need help. I think the government is trying to do as much as it can. In fact, that stimulus is probably one of the largest we've ever seen. And as Boris Johnson said, this is really a wartime effort. I think, there are going to be other fiscal measures put in place as we go forward, but, anything that is useful and helpful is to be welcomed.
And do you think there's anything that we can learn from this, as a country, a wider community?
Actually, I think there's something we can learn globally. It is not a great idea to have wet markets. Whoever thought that it's okay to sell live bats next to chickens, next to produce that is used for human consumption really needs to be rethought. If you look at these viruses, whether it's SARS or MERS or indeed this coronavirus, they've all originated in animals. They've all made the leap into humans. And that is because of the close proximity of animals and humans. And so we need to ban wet markets immediately. China needs to take action and take action now.